biggest economies in the world are what? The United States and China. And if we look at the United States, we have had a monetary contraction. The stock of money in the U.S. system now, when you measure money broadly by M2 in the United States, it's actually lower than it was in July of 2022. We've only had 4 other occasions where we've had contractions in the money supply since the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913. We got to go back to 1948, 49. We had one then. 37, 38, we had another one. And then, of course, the big one in 1929, 1933. And prior to that, 1920, 1921. You have to go way back to find one of these contractions. And every one that's ever occurred, we've either had the Great Depression in 1929, 1933, or pretty good recession. So that suggests to me we will have a recession, and it's baked in the cake because economic activity lags behind changes in the money supply. So if you get change in the money supply, then with a lag, a long and variable lag, you get changes in economic activity and changes in inflation. In the U.S., my outlook is for early in 2025, we'll probably be in a pretty serious slowdown and recession. China actually is coming in lower and many more problems than people anticipated. And the money supply there, again, is growing lower than the golden growth rate. Hanke's golden growth rate is roughly 9% for China. Now, that would be a rate consistent with hitting their inflation target of about 3%. So their current growth rate in the money supply is running about 6%. It's been a little below the golden growth rate for some time. So they're struggling. So both countries are hitting a patch of rough water because of the money supply problems. Big thing in the United States is the fact that the Fed, remember the COVID pandemic hit in early 2020, February of 2020, and the Fed accelerated the money supply, and actually in February of 2021, it hit on a year-over-year basis an all-time high of about 27% per year. And that was followed, of course, with a high inflation. It was John Greenwood and I using the quantity theory of money and looking at the money supply. We anticipated that it would go up as high as 9% per year in the United States. It went up to 9.1. And then, of course, the Fed does what? It starts slamming on the brakes with quantitative tightening and a significant increase in the federal funds rate. So we've had tight money and this contraction in the money supply, over tightness, and that's where we're at today. And inflation, by the way, is of course falling. It's at 3% per year in the United States. I anticipate, Greenwood and I have modeled this and think it'll come in at 2.5 to 3 by the end of the year. We're already kind of in our sweet spot, our zone. Again, looking at the money supply. What happened in the money supply in previous quarters and years affects what's happening today in the United States and every place else too. One big thing, and that is the models they use are what we call post-Keynesian macroeconomic models, and those models don't include money. The main post-Keynesian models don't include money at all. So the theory ripped out of the macroeconomic playbook. That's one reason all the younger economists, this has been going on for about 30 years. All of the rather recent arrivals in the research departments at these central banks, they don't have models that use money. The second thing is that they claim, in the United States anyway, and the UK, this has been the same thing in the UK, they claim that this equation of exchange thing that I said, M plus V equals P plus Y, they say that doesn't work. It certainly worked for John Greenwood and I. We're one of the two people who got the inflation right on the way up and got it right on the way down. And the central banks, none of them were able to predict anything. With these post-Keynesian models, they never got inflation. They never understood what inflation was all about. And they've come up with all these non-monetary factors that supposedly cause inflation. So one reason is the modeling, the theory. The second thing is a practical thing, and that is when inflation rears its ugly head, of course, that's a bad thing. People don't like it. It's a tax. Inflation is a tax, the inflation tax. And the central bankers always want to be in a position of saying, it's not me, it's the guy behind the tree. And to do that, you have to go to non-monetary factors that are causing inflation, not money, because central bankers are responsible for money and the money supply and the stock of money. So they want to get the monkey off their back. Once inflation starts rearing its ugly head, the central bankers want to take the exit door in a hurry, and the easiest way to do that is say, oh, this recent bout of inflation we've had, what's that all about? It's about supply chain glitches that we had. Remember about all that? We had all that talk about supply chain glitches, and they said, oh, now we've got those fixed and inflation's coming down thanks to the glitches being fixed. Or they say oil price increases caused inflation, or the war in Ukraine. There's a plethora of non-monetary factors that they come up with, but this is all a great distraction to get the monkey off their back. When you say liquidity growth, we're talking about changes in the money supply, the stock of money. If you change the inflation target, let's say instead of 2%, if it was 0, you could easily get the right result by just cranking back a notch or two on the growth rate in the money supply. And remember, monetary policy is what? It's about changes in the money supply. And the central banks aren't looking at that. Most of them. If you look at worldwide what happened, by the way, another important thing to keep in mind is that inflation, it's not a global problem, it's a local problem depending on what the local central banks doing to the money supply. And that's what we found in the pandemic. Greenwood and I have just looked at 27 countries that account for about 75% of the world's GDP. And you have one group that we have roller coaster rides where as you goose the money supply goes up, and with a lag, you get inflation going up. Then they get scared and they tighten things up. Money supply starts going down. With a lag, inflation goes down. Well, the thrill was in places like the US, UK, the Eurozone, Egypt, Venezuela, Brazil. I could go on down the list. That's where money supply went up a lot and then came down a lot. Inflation went up a lot, came down a lot. And then you get other countries like China where things remain pretty much the same. And where did their inflation peak out? After the peak increase in their money supply, inflation peaked out after, as I recall, about 19 months with a lag at 2.1% per year in China. The list of places where the roller coaster ride was not that wild would include not only China, but you have Japan, Switzerland, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, South Africa. The roller coaster was kind of mild. There was a roller coaster, but kind of mild. And the countries where it was wild and big, US, UK, Eurozone, Denmark, Sweden, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Brazil, Egypt, Ghana, Israel, Mexico, Nigeria, Peru, Philippines. Those I just ticked off the 27 countries involved, but again, inflation is not global, it is local, and it depends on what the local central bank's doing to the money supply. And we found out, by the way, interesting, the lag was very consistent. The lag between changes in the money supply, the peak of the money supply, and then the peak of the inflation that followed. That part was interesting for us because long ago, Milton Friedman, in his studies of inflation changes in money supply in the United States, found that the lag, it was about 24 months. And what did we find? We found that the mean change, the average lag, was 23.9 months, and the median in those 27 countries that we looked at, median lag was 23 months. So it was more or less right on what Friedman had found a long time ago. And you could see the mean and the median are almost the same, so there's not much dispersion in the lags that were occurring. They were almost all the same. The problem most people have, they look at contemporary data and they fail to realize that the movements in the contemporary data that they're looking at, they're caused by changes in the money supply that happened a year ago or 2 years ago or maybe even 3 years ago. Now, for somebody who's paying attention to the money supply, of course, this is very valuable to be looking at changes in the money supply because whatever happens, we know with these lags, between changes in the money supply and changes in economic activity and inflation. We know those contemporary changes, they've been baked in the cake a long time ago. But most people get all crossed up with it. They're just looking at contemporary data. They're not looking back, and they're certainly not looking at the money supply, most people. The magnitude of the recessions depends on a lot of other things going on in general state of business confidence. That's one factor. And the other factor is whether the Fed, a central bank in the United States, continues with quantitative tightening. What if the recession starts and they're still continuing with the money supply growing at an anemic rate, let's say 1% per year instead of 5 or 6? So it depends. So the magnitude is kind of tricky and something I don't want to make a conjecture about what it might be, the magnitude. And also the exact timing of this. You can't tell with much accuracy exactly what the lag is going to be, because as Friedman found out in all these early studies that he did, as well as all the other monetarists, the lags are long and variable. So the variation depends on lots of other things going on. I think we're probably pretty safe by saying we'll start seeing a pretty good slowdown early next year. That's about it. Problem with the Fed, they're always late to the party. That's why you have the roller coaster. That's why things do go up and do go down. There wasn't much of a roller coaster in the 1990s up until the great financial crisis in 2008 in the United States. And the reason why is that, remember, Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at most of that period of time. The money supply was pretty close to Hanke's golden growth rate of about 5 to 6%, and inflation was, hovering around 2%, a little bit less actually.